So I want to look at representations of plantations in American art really before the Civil War, although we're going to look at a few images related to after the war. And what we want to explore here is how the plantation was idealized and called into question through art. And we're going to start with some art that I think we can fairly say idealizes plantation life. This is an anonymous work of art from around 1800. Some believe it may have been created even by an African-American artist. And you'll notice that it's a celebration of life in the slave quarters. And so we have these depictions of the slave quarters buildings. And in the front, we have a painting of a dance celebration. And this is a pretty positive representation of slavery, right? We're not seeing people being brutalized in the fields. We're not seeing people being whipped. We're not seeing women being raped. We're not seeing representations of all the horrible things that are happening. What we're seeing a representation of is a moment of joy on the slave quarters. It's interesting that the slaves are up front, that the image is framed by the quarters, and in the back is the plantation. This is actually very unusual for pre-Civil War paintings. A more typical example of plantation art before the Civil War is something like this. And what we see is the plantation at the top of the hill, represented as sort of the pinnacle of the culture. We also see its integration with nature. It's presented as almost an organic part of nature. You got the river and the schooner. And so here is a very sort of positive image of slavery. And one of the many things that's striking about this picture is the absence of any slaves. We see the slave quarters presented in this almost artistic pyramid that goes up the hill, but no slaves. So in many ways, slavery is euphemized by this plantation depiction. The darker sides of it are hidden while the idealized narrative is celebrated. What is creepy about this painting is you can find this as a poster, and you will find this painting as a poster framed in people's homes. And you can buy it on, Art Store or art.com or Amazon. You can find this now if you wanted to and have a poster of it in your house, which is a little odd given the way that it presents slavery so counter to its historical reality. So here are some things that historians have said about plantation art and representations of plantations. So before the Civil War, there's this idealized representation of the plantation as a beautiful pinnacle of American culture. Classically designed buildings situated in beautiful landscapes that are often represented as economically productive, but rarely depict any work and certainly never any abuse of slaves. More importantly, more strikingly, many times the slaves that do appear in the paintings are aestheticized, presented as objects of the natural environment rather than human beings held in bondage. After the war, things change a little bit, but really much of the pro-slavery plantation art still focuses on representing the plantation positively with a nostalgic quality. This is important for us to note where we are in the class right now, because the same thing happens to Uncle Tom's Cabin. After the Civil War, Uncle Tom's Cabin becomes sort of a place to entertain nostalgic beliefs about Southern plantation life rather than this radical anti-slavery narrative. So we want to look for this shift as we look at some of the paintings in the next few slides. So here's a classic example of what we just read about in the previous slide. The house, the classically built plantation, is presented as the harmonized pinnacle of the landscape. We've got the elite here and their beautiful horses. We've got signs of economic productivity, probably sugar processing going on there in the back. The slaves are not laboring. They are looking admiringly either at the privileged aristocratic whites or the house itself. They are part of the landscape. And these plantation paintings are really more landscape paintings. And it's important to remember who was paying for them. It was usually the plantation owners themselves who would pay for these representations of their status and their property. And this is a painting right before the war. Okay, let's look at another one. This one I think is a really interesting painting because of its perspective, right? We're on a hill looking down at a valley. At the center of the valley is this beautiful plantation home. We've got the lovely white picket fences, the lovely buildings, which are actually slave quarters, where terrible things are happening, built in right to the landscape. Over here, we see neatly gathered stacks of hay, and very interestingly, tiny figures of slaves integrated as if they're just sort of part of the painting, and they're represented as harmonious. They have sort of coordinated, synchronized white shirts and dark pants. It's a happy, productive place. So we see work going on. There's more work going on here, but the work is integrated as part of the landscape. And the landscape could fit right in almost with one of the Hudson River paintings that we looked at Hudson River School paintings that we looked at earlier in the course. So this is the plantation as landscape. This is the plantation as pinnacle of American culture, rather than the plantation as gulag, rather than the plantation as a center of human abuse, torture, imprisonment, rape, and the list goes on. Now, here's a sort of celebratory image of plantation life after the Civil War. So we're in the Reconstruction era, and we're not going to get too much into that, but by the 1880s, basically the hope of early Reconstruction, where African Americans had the right to vote, some were being sent to Congress, there were hopes for an economic revolution, that's all been crushed by the white dominant political group in the South. And by the 1880s, we are really organized around a sharecropper economy where aristocratic, privileged, wealthy white owners still control the plantation, but blacks are now allegedly free economic participants in this. And so you'll see the emphasis on how happy and healthy and well-dressed and well put together all of these sharecroppers are, how they are interacting constructively with the whites who run the plantation. This is much more of a representation of a successfully working plantation. We have the steamboats in the background. We've got the smoke of probably the sugar processing shack over here. So what we're looking at is sort of a small southern post-Civil War plantation that's being presented not as the economic crisis it was, not as the system built on the brutalized labor of sharecroppers who never were really propertied, but instead this lovely harmonized image of productivity in the American South, and a nostalgia for the plantation as the enduring center of the Southern economy and Southern culture. So let's move on and take look at a few other images. Now, this image is always startling to me because it's not going to be created until the 1990s, and it's in the U.S. Capitol building. And it's meant to sort of be, I think, a tribute to African Americans and the labor that they did as sharecroppers. But it's so idealized, it's so naive, or deliberately cloaking of the reality of what was happening. The cotton is beautiful, and the white of the slaves matches the cotton, and nobody looks stressed or abused. Nobody looks like they're working 16 hours a day out in the fields for almost nothing. This looks like sharecropping was awesome. What a great life for everybody. And so this has been very problematic for a lot of African-American cultural critics who were and continue to be disturbed by this image. So what we want to do is, now that we've looked at sort of the celebratory images of the plantation, take a look at some of the images from before the war and after that have a much more critical or questioning perspective on it. So we start here with this interesting image of the destruction of a sugar house and a plantation. And you've got the Native American looking across the landscape at this decayed image of plantation life, and you almost feel as if nature, as represented by the trees and the Native American, are taking back the land, right? And that the plantation system is presented here as crumbling rather than as a proud center of the American Southern economy. And then, of course, you get direct critiques of slavery, and in this case, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which was a key precipitating event in the emergence of Uncle Tom's Cabin. The Fugitive Slave Act required Northerners to return escaped blacks to their Southern owners, and it roused up fury in the North. Not just among abolitionists, but really among a majority of whites in the North, who, while they were willing to tolerate slavery in the South, certainly weren't willing to actively perpetuate it. And so this is an example of art that was critical of slavery and the plantation world, and it's from around 1850, which is the time of the Fugitive Slave Act. This is a fascinating painting to me because it is from Uncle Tom's Cabin, the novel, and the novel was hugely popular. The play that we read was based off the novel, and the play was popular too, but the novel was really the heart of the whole Uncle Tom experience. And this is really a interesting image because you can see how the plantation itself is being idealized here. Tom is very well dressed. He's with the beautiful angel Evangelina, right, little Eva, and everything looks so wonderful and positive. And this is where we can see the seeds of a nostalgic imagination of the Southern plantation as a place of idealized beauty that works against the larger anti-slavery message of Uncle Tom's Cabin, of the novel and the story of Tom's life and suffering that you now have read. Here's another depiction of Uncle Tom's Cabin, this one done by an African-American artist. And again, it's basically meant to be a version of kind of the same scene. And you can see here that it's darker, that it's more brooding, that it looks less celebratory and more sort of ominous. Still, little Eva is celebrated as the white patron saint, although you'll notice that she's half in the dark. So there's a darkness about this vision created by an African-American artist that doesn't have necessarily the same nostalgic quality as the earlier illustration that we looked at. Here's some more interesting representations of slavery in art. And what's interesting about this one is it kind of takes a pro-slavery depiction of slavery. It sort of argues that African-American slaves in the South are relatively happy and relatively well cared for compared to slavery in England, which wasn't really slavery, but industrial labor. And the argument here was many times made in the South that the slaves were better off than poor factory workers in the North and in Dickens's Victorian England. And if you've read Dickens, you know that conditions were pretty bad there. So this is an interesting sort of counterattack on the critique of slavery represented through what we would now recognize as cartoons, right? Okay. political cartoons. Here's another representation of slavery, but here we have African Americans gathered for a funeral in the woods slash forest, and you can see here that there is a pretty rich representation of African American cultural life in this painting. Very celebratory, but also you see here a darkness and an isolation, right? This is dark. So here are the African Americans, and they are shining in the light in the center of the picture, but all around them is darkness. Sort of a symbolic representation of their efforts to sort of escape from outside the plantation world to a spiritual place of more meaning and some sense of purpose beyond the torture and imprisonment of slavery. Okay, that's all I've got for my show here. I hope those images are interesting to you and give you some things to think about as you work on your paper and or process your experience with Uncle Tom's Cabin, slave songs, and the other different types of art we've been talking about. Thanks.